Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be talking about the E-Block rotation, which has just been announced. It's going to be happening on the 5th of April, the same time as the EUIC. So this is pretty much the same as last season, where we got the introduction of Scarlet and Violet as well as the rotation, and in the same case here, we're going to be getting the Temporal Forces expansion in time for the EUIC, as well as this rotation kicking in all in one go. So today, myself and Jack are going to be talking about how this rotation is going to impact those decks that we currently have in formats, as well as possibly some new inclusions that we have already released from Temporal Forces. So plenty to go over today.
So we'll kick off with some headlines, and to be honest, it's a bit of a weird rotation. There's some huge cards going. There's a couple of really big archetypes that are going to be rotating, but it feels a little bit tamer than some rotations we've had in the past. Kicking things off, I think the two biggest cards, individual cards, are Path to the Peak rotating and Battle of VIP Pass. Path to the Peak is a stadium right now that really limits how much certain decks can do, and I think there's going to be a lot of decks that are pretty happy to see it go. It is kind of the backbone of a strategy of a couple of different archetypes, so there will be decks that miss it, but I think in general people will be quite pleased to see this one go. But more importantly, VIP Pass is a very controversial sort of love it or hate it card that the longer time has gone on, I think the community has started to realize that this is not a particularly healthy card for the game. So again, I think people are going to be very happy to see this one leave. We'll talk about a couple of replacements momentarily, but yeah, these are two cards that are very, very meta warping, very, very impactful, and I think these are going to be the individual biggest losses we see. There are a couple of other notable losses in terms of item cards and stuff like that as well, though. Level Ball is another great search card that we have right now that is seeing a lot more play, especially with the introduction of some of these evolving decks, things like Curly is being searchable, things like other basics after VIP Pass, after that turn one, is really useful. So we're going to be seeing that go. Escape Rope is also rotating, and it's a really interesting card. It always finds itself in a variety of different decks. It can be seen as sort of a tech card for trying to increase the pressure in the early turns when your opponent maybe hasn't got many basics out, or even getting out of sort of control strategies that we've seen as of late. So it's another one that always finds its way in. Similarly to Cross Switcher, typically this is a lot more aggressive though. Things like Greninja plus Cancer and Cologne combos often go hand in hand with Cross Switcher, so they may no longer be on the table, though Greninja does still seem to be pretty effective potentially if you're able to still set it up. And then a couple of supporters as well. Avery, Raihan and Clara have all seen large amounts of success in a variety of different decks over their time in Standard. I think more recently Avery has sort of picked up with the release of things like Screamtail, but Raihan has always sort of weaved together combos, and Clara has been really good in some of these Lost Box decks. So yeah, in terms of the headlines of cards, I think those are the biggest ones we're going to see rotating.
And then of course there's a couple of huge decks going as well. Mew v Max, I think many players are rejoicing because this has been a constant presence since its release in Fusion Strike, and it's finally going to be put away, as is the Rapid Strike archetype, which has had its ebbs and flows in the metagame, but has been a really solid deck overall, and right now is one of the top decks in the game, I would say. So seeing these completely go thanks to rotation is also going to have a profound impact on what decks are going to be shaping the metagame in the next set. And if you want to have a more detailed look at the E-Block cards that will be rotating, there's a few cards here that you may not have seen for a year or so, but were once relevant cards. I've put it all on a Cube Koga list, so you can have a deeper dive into exactly what's going if you want to start sifting through your binders and getting rid of cards here and there as and when you need to. But also throughout the video, we're going to be referencing these individual cards which make up certain archetypes and how they're going to be changing. So you might be seeing some of these again, but yeah, if you want to really get into the weeds of it all, you can check out the Cube Koga document.
So on to some post-rotation survivors. We will be talking about a couple of cards momentarily, but as we've mentioned, the biggest archetypes that we're losing are Mew VMAX and Rapid Strike. Everything else on the screen kind of survives in some way or other, some better than others. I think the only one that we're still kind of debating is probably Arceus right at the bottom, in the bottom right-hand corner. I think everything else, maybe Snorlax as well, everything else on the list sort of can adapt. Like I say, there'll be some that lose a little bit more than others, but in general, I think that there's only two major archetypes rotating, which is kind of rare. Sometimes we see metas warp completely when like the top 3 decks rotate, but whilst Mew has always been a presence and Rapid Strike has always kind of been an oppressive presence when it's been in the meta, you're still going to be seeing a lot of the familiar archetypes that you're seeing across the table at the moment. So it might be a little bit different compared to previous rotations.
And then just before we get into the big losses for most of these archetypes, I did just want to talk about some of the introductions that we'll get from Temporal Forces. Now, we haven't seen the full set list by any means. There's still more cards coming out. There's still a number of A-spec cards we're meant to be seeing, as well as some extra supporter cards and this, that, and the other. So this isn't by any means a exhaustive list of what the brand new set that will come out at the same time as this rotation. But some of the key takeaways that we know of so far is that A-specs are going to be returning. That's why the Prime Catcher is that vibrant pink color, because you can only play one copy of it in your deck. But this seems like a really, really powerful card that pretty much at the moment, at least, based on the other A-specs that we've seen, this Prime Catcher is going to be a one-of in basically every deck because it is a Guzma effect on an item card. That is ridiculously powerful. So just bear that in mind, that there will be opportunities for decks to have this, not only a switching card, but also a gusting card in item form. So it makes things like Arven, for example, a much better supporter card because at any point it can convert into a gusting option, similar to how Counter Catch has been a thing in the format for a while. Buddy Poffin. This is a huge, huge item card that is going to be a pseudo replacement for Battle VIP Pass for a number of decks which have either low hit point engine Pokemon like Comfey and the Lost Zone engine, or evolving basic decks. So the likes of Charizard and Gardevoir, even Chien-Pao, these sorts of archetypes will still hang on in there because they have great basic ball search for their engine Pokemon. You can get out your multiple Rolts, you can get your Pidgeys and Charmanders and whatnot. This card is massive. And the main thing about Buddy Poffin that's the upside compared to Battle VIP Pass, it's obviously a much more limited card. It can only get Pokemon with 70 hit points or less, but you can use it throughout the entire game. So you can use a Super Rod mid-game, then Buddy Poffin and get your basics straight back into the mix. So this is a really big upgrade, and actually it's a real relief, I think, to see this card come out in Temporal Forces when we do lose that Battle VIP Pass. So really VIP is going to be a bigger loss for like turbo engines like Roaring Moon, for example, which we'll get onto throughout the video, because Poffin can be a bit of a side grade to VIP Pass for some of these other sort of more setup-based decks. Cryptomaniac's a fantastic supporter card, actually. Searching your deck for 2 cards, putting them on top of the deck in any order is phenomenal when we have amazing synergy cards in the format. Radiant Greninja is one of the first ones that springs to mind. You can guarantee that your Greninja gets the 2 best cards out of your deck for the situation, which sounds really dangerous. Even things like Pokestop can be a great synergy here. There's obviously Curlier, still in format, and Gardevoir still seems to be a powerful archetype. So even things like Goldengo, there's a ton of cards right now that synergize with this supporter. There's a lot of decks that already are sort of tied to other supporters, like think of the Lost Zone engine, they're so heavily tied to Colress. There's going to be Sada engines that can't really take advantage of this Cryptomaniac, but I genuinely think that this supporter could go alongside things like Iono and Boss to just make up your full supporter package for these decks that don't need to have any other specific supporter in their deck for acceleration or whatnot. So yeah, this is actually a really huge supporter card, and it's going to really make some like combos happen, I think, when you combine this even with like Mew EX or with Barrel, these sorts of cards. This is going to be a fantastic supporter, so definitely one to keep in mind. And then for these like attacking Pokemon, Raging Bolt seems like a pretty promising Ancient Mon, where it's going to be in this sort of Sada toolbox more than likely, alongside Sandy Shocks, where it can deal some really high damage output. It could also go in a Lost Engine because it has a multiple type attack option, so we could be going for Mirage Gates, but I think that'll be quite expensive. Gouging Fire, again, alongside Sada and alongside Magma Basin, could be a high damage output basic. Iron Leaves, it's a grass type, so it could be a new basic option that can respond into Charizard. I think, again, this could be a decent gate option because it has 1 colorless in its attack cost, so it could be a way that Lost Box adapts. And then Iron Crown EX, it's a future Pokemon, so it's going to help buff other future Pokemon. That's its idea with its ability, so it could help out a potential Valiant variant. I feel like Xatu might have a place in the format. Again, that's another Pokemon that really benefits from Cryptomaniac, actually, where you're drawing 2 off the Xatu effect. And I think even though we haven't really seen much from a Xatu Iron Valiant deck right now, I think some math fixing potentially from Iron Crown and the fact that its own attack gets around Manaphy makes it a really dangerous sniping option. So these are some of the basic Pokemon that we've seen so far from Temporal Forces. Just a few footnotes really there of what these cards could be doing in the format, but the majority of our focus today is going to be on the existing decks rather than these, and we'll be bringing out lists with these sorts of things closer to the time. So keep those in mind as we look look towards sort of replacing those sorts of cards like Battle VIP Pass and such in the current decks in the format.
So the first deck we're going to take a look at is Charizard Pidgeot, arguably one of the best, if not the best deck in format right now. Has had some brilliant successes recently. Biggest losses, definitely that VIP Pass. Obviously, this is an archetype that actually can get away with using Buddy Poffin, which is really nice. There are certain bits and bobs that you can't get out with the Buddy Poffin, but realistically, you're going to be aiming for multiple Charmanders, multiple Pidgeys, so that's not too big of a loss, luckily. Mew is obviously a nice setup Pokemon in the early turns as well, helping you weave together Arven plus the additional piece combos, usually Candy, to then start chaining Pidgeot into Charizard and really starting to be aggressive. So that will, I think, be a little bit more of a loss. And finally, Escape Rope as well. Escape Rope is teched in here and there every now and again, sometimes to help for certain situations where you're trapped or you need to try it being a little bit more aggressive against sort of lone or awkward board states your opponent has, especially with how powerful an early Charizard EX can be. Pretty happy to see Path go. Path is one of the biggest enemies of Charizard. Its Inferno Rain ability is basically the backbone of the deck, along with Quick Search to piece together the combos. So happy seeing those go. There are a couple of interesting ability locking options here and there, but Path is the most universal one and therefore the one that everyone kind of splashes in, so you're never going to be sad to see that one go. And similarly with Rapid Urshi, I think Urshi has really actually had a bit of a breath of life with TM Devo over the past few weeks. Rotation sees the whole archetype go, which is really nice because it means that your low HP basics that you can eventually get devolved into, as well as just early pressure that they can sometimes apply so that you're really able to ever get one Charizard out, things like that. That's not really an issue anymore. Still think it's going to be a really popular and powerful archetype. Typically when you see when rotations happen, there's archetypes that don't lose too much, don't really gain too much, but are already good archetypes that don't really get hurt too much. And I'm pretty sure Charizard already being at the top now means it's going to sit quite near the top going forward. Again, we don't have the full set list or anything like that, but it would be a fair shout to say this is likely to be one of the best contenders, especially in the early few weeks of the meta when people haven't necessarily been able to refine newer lists to be able to rely on Old Faithful Charizard Pidgeot just getting you through the game with insane stats and that kind of stuff.
Onto Lost Zone Giratina. I think it's a bit more precarious for this archetype, actually, because as we've seen as of late, Path of the Peak has been a big reason why Giratina has kept around in the last few sets. That path has been so massive for the Charizard matchup, even helping out against like Miraidon, Gardevoir. There's so many reasons why Path was a huge card, and actually the selling point of Tina was it was one of the better Path decks available because it didn't require many rule box abilities on its own end. So as soon as you lose that huge selling point of the deck, is it worth even playing this Lost engine, or should we start looking towards playing other Lost boxes? Still a little bit tricky because Tina at least still has, you know, decent bulk, no weakness, and can be decent into like 2v2 matchups like Miraidon, for example, even without Path of the Peak. So there may still be huge reasons to want to play this archetype, but it does seem to be less defensive overall. And as we know, Giratina isn't necessarily the most consistent deck in the room. So the fact that you're no longer able to make these hero comeback plays with this Path plus Rocks disruption, is it going to be the best Lost Zone engine? I'm a little bit skeptical. It's at least happy to see Mew rotate. That was one of the only like poor matchups for Giratina, really, on paper. It seems to be a 50-50 deck in the format. In part, that was because of its great defensive and like comeback potential. You still have a lot of that potential, honestly. Roxanne plus Countercatcher is still huge, doing Sableye plays and such to get rid of, you know, other draw engine Pokemon and this, that, and the other. There's still good defensive plays available to Tina, but it's much more likely that the opponent can have stuff sat on board and still make a comeback against them. So it's a little bit more volatile and it needs to draw good in basically every game it plays now, and that's not really the selling point of Giratina. It's not known for that. Those are the things I'm a little bit concerned about for Tina. It may be outshone by other Lost boxes just because Path of the Peak was such a valuable weapon in its arsenal.
Onto Gardevoir EX, and this is probably one of the decks that is hit the most by rotation. It's the engine is going to completely change or some of the attacking engine is going to completely change for the most part. You can see that there's some huge cards under the biggest losses section. VIP Pass Level Ball and Fog Crystal is basically the backbone of all of Gardevoir's sort of setup right now. We do have Buddy Poffin, we do have Nest Ball, we do have Ultra Ball. It's likely that these are all going to go up in counts just to try and make sure you're still getting your Ralts into play to then get your Curlies into play and start motoring through the deck as usual, but all of those feel like downgrades compared to what we had before, so that's not ideal. Avery has sort of weaved its way into more recent lists, again, since Screamtail's release, to try and pressure certain decks and other revolving decks, as well as pick off key targets or multiple key targets in a turn with the combination of Screamtail plus Avery. So that's not necessarily sort of a consistency thing, it's more of a tech kind of thing, but could still be a little bit awkward to see. Again, in Mew, quite similarly for the setup option. Similarly with Mirage Step as well. Mirage Step kind of got you out of awkward spots where you maybe only found one or two Ralts and you were going to struggle to get multiple Refinement Curliers on the board. The Mirage Step Curlier was kind of your get out of jail free card, so not really having that again might prove awkward. Also, there's Zacian and Gardevoir, which are arguably two of the most important attackers in the deck right now. They kind of are that unlimited damage cap that Gardevoir typically tries to boast, and realistically it's going to have to look at other ways it can try and take prizes now. Things like Screamtail and maybe even Drifloon might be back in the deck trying to use other one prize attacking options to sort of dodge and weave your way through, rather than having this huge damage cap. Maybe you're trying to take out key threats here and there. Path of the Peak rotating is actually one big one though. Get rid of their draw engine throughout the early turns and then trying to pair a Path of the Peak with Roxanne or Iono in the mid to late turns. That was often ways people would try and counter Gardevoir, so that not being a strategy anymore could be useful. The deck still has great draw power, and realistically the energy acceleration on Gardevoir EX is second to none. It's one of the best cards we've ever seen realistically, so I think it's likely that we're still going to see a way of making this deck work. Arven may be the new way to try and play this. Maybe we're going to see an evolution package again with the Evo TM that was kind of toyed around with when it first revealed. Or maybe just that Cryptomaniacs deciphering that Joe mentioned earlier. Getting the exact 2 cards you need every now and again may just be enough to get Gardevoir sort of over the line with all the draw engine it has and the variety of different attackers you can still use. So there's still hope there. I think the lists are going to look very different, but in early lists we've kind of built, it's actually not looked as scary as you may think when looking at the array of cards we're losing. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Gardevoir adapts, considering there are some big losses, but the cards it still has are still very, very powerful.
Onto Miraidon with Iron Hands then. This also actually gets a few big hits. The Path of the Peak is one of the big things, so at the moment there's this debate whether we should be playing Judge plus Iono and Path, or should we be playing a more turbo engine, and with Path obviously rotating, it means we have to play the turbo list, but even turbo takes a hit, because Peony was one of the key supporter cards that the turbo engines look towards, so you can guarantee, those multiple generators, which was integral to getting that early amp you very much pressure. So now it's a little bit trickier to do so. I think Arven could be coming back into the fold for Miraidon, especially with Prime Catcher coming in to the format as well. It means, early on you can get Forest Seal Stone plus Generator, and then in the sort of mid-game, Arven doesn't fall off quite as hard because it basically converts into a Guzma, which is no bad thing. But also some of the key acceleration for Miraidon is going to be leaving us, where we lose Dynamotor from Flaffy, as well as Raihan, which was typically like a one-of in these turbo-based builds. So it's really going to have to look towards other options if it wants to retain a decent means of streaming attackers. And I think it's going to be going quite theme deck-like, really, where we're going towards that sort of 15, 16 plus basic energy count. So your ratios for Electric Generator are just much higher, so you can get multiple hits, not only for that early pressure, but just maintaining your attackers throughout the entire game is going to be pretty important. EXP share, that's recently actually already been in Nick Moffat's most successful list with Miraidon, and I think that's going to become more and more of a staple in the deck, just bank energy throughout the entire game so you're not missing a beat towards the latter stages. And at the same time, there's even the energy sticker. I know Azul's even played around this on a few streams, and it is a bit of a meme card. It's coin flip based, which no one really enjoys, but it can be some extra acceleration, and if there's no better options for Miraidon, it could be making its way into the deck list. So the list itself is going to look a little bit jankier, I think, but the selling points are still there for the deck list, and to be honest, it's quite happy to see a number of these matchups going. Previously, it's had to tech Spiritomb to even have a decent chance into most of these Mews. It's not been heavily unfavoured into Urshifu, but by no means enjoyed the matchup and normally had to draw the better of the two players. And Kyogre was a great way for Lost Zone box players to have a really good time into Miraidon, with that option of Aquastorm leaving the Lost Box list. Sometimes this early amp you very much pressure is actually enough to overcome them these days. And of course, Path in other decks, like Tina for example, were huge issues for Miraidon. And seeing all of these go actually makes the path a lot clearer for Miraidon in terms of the matchups around it. Still has to worry about that Charizard, which is going to be a concern, no doubt. But against other decks in the format and other racing archetypes that could be coming out in the format, some of these Sada-based builds that I mentioned from Temporal Forces, Miraidon might still be in that mix and still be a very dangerous archetype. So it's going to look a lot worse than it is right now. But in terms of meta placement, it could still be in a decent spot.
Onto Lost Zone box, and we've already kind of touched on this a little bit with Giratina, but the sort of the layout is slightly different for Lost Zone box because typically it's a wider array of attackers, and you can see there's a variety of different attackers we've got on the screen right now. I think the biggest loss these days is actually probably going to be Kyogre in terms of attacking options. We've just kind of mentioned how it's an option to try and gain multiple prizes in a turn, especially against some of these higher HP basic decks that maybe it would be more difficult to deal with sort of multiple turns of Cramorant or Sableye. Kyogre was always kind of that option. So losing Kyogre from Energy Recycler kind of takes that option away completely. Obviously, we've already mentioned VIP Pass. Again, you're still able to play Poffin for the comp phase, but it might be a little bit harder to find Cramorants and some of these attackers now. So maybe we're going to have to have more of a blend of Nest Balls in there as well. A couple of key supporters, Raihan and Clara, definitely have both seen huge success in multiple different Lost Zone box archetypes. We're kind of looking at this from a Lost Zone box perspective, but also from a Sablezard perspective, hence the Echoing Horn and Fog Crystal as well, which have been typically very popular key cards in that kind of archetype as well. So there's a lot of sort of not necessarily huge options. I think Kyogre is probably one of the biggest things, along with VIP Pass, like I mentioned, but a lot of things that maybe are going to be a little bit less optimal. Maybe you're going to have to start looking at some other attackers to try and fill the gaps. Again, really happy to see Path rotate. I think a lot of decks are kind of in the same boat where Path was quite limiting to some of their mid to late game strategies or even early game strategies in some instances. So never going to be sort of sad to see Path rotating. In terms of the outlook for Lost Zone box, I think we kind of think Gate is so powerful. It's still going to be in and around these relevant archetypes. Trying to turbo Gate ramp and make sure you're getting to 7 as quickly as possible to get powerful attackers still seems very useful and might actually be the best way, if not the only way, to still beat some of these racing decks like the Sada decks and maybe even Miraidon. I've already kind of mentioned how there may be a couple of these EX Pokemon from Temporal Forces that may weave their way in. I think it's likely to just stay as sort of a counter box kind of thing where you're looking for attackers that maybe fill one or two matchups quite well, and then gates to kind of weave it all together. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how effective things like Cramorant and stuff are going forward now. They're maybe a little bit more difficult to find. But I think in general, being able to still gate to a lot of a wide variety of attackers is going to still keep this archetype alive. Lots to think about with Lost Zone. I think it's still likely to be there, but knowing how impactful Kyogre has been over the past basically since rotation, I think that's going to be one of the bigger losses that maybe wouldn't have been considered in the first place.
Onto Snorlax, and it's actually also losing a ton of cards. VIP Pass was typically a one-off, but also just made the Arven package of Snorlax so much smoother to get multiple block established and also get that Rotom in the mix. So that is going to be a loss, and obviously can't play the Poffin because all of its stuff has such high hit points. A lot of supporters go as well, Peonia being one of the key ones because obviously you can't access your prize cards. You do have Hisuian Heavy Ball, so you can play still one counts of Rotom and Mimikyu. But your other crucial tech supporter cards like Erica's Invitation and this, that, and the other, those sorts of supporters, you probably have to bump up in additional counts. So you're just going to take more space up in your deck because otherwise, if you just happen to prize your crucial one-off supporter for X or Y matchup, you're just not going to be able to have access to that card. Avery Echoing Horn is also the big one, I think, here, because it completely changes how your opponent can go about the Snorlax stall matchup. At the moment, you have to be concerned about having Pokemon in hand as well as in the discard pile as well as in play, and now with Avery Horn going, you can freely just discard every non-good attacking Pokemon from your hand as soon as you see it. So you can play around the Erica's Invitation, and that's one of the crucial selling points of Snorlax really, is that you will find a way to trap something throughout the game, and without this threat your opponent can make that much less of a possibility. So it feels like the archetype is getting a little bit less dangerous. We also lose Sydney Kidney, so you can't really win a Stadium War quite as easily. You still can with Silene and this, that, and the other, but you can't really attack things like Jet Energy so easily either at the moment, and that's going to be a problem. I've thrown on another couple control cards just to be a talking point. We are losing Mewtwo v Union, which has been, a tanking archetype for a while, hasn't seen play, since Charizard EX has done a ton, but it's still something just to mention. Dunsparce is going, which has recently been in the Pidgeot EX builds of Snorlax, so losing that's a shame, and also it was helping you protect the Snorlax itself against Minior, so obviously Pidgeot Lax is also concerned. Even with Path going, Pidgeot Lax may not be possible because of the threat of Miraidon as a matchup, and Dunsparce can no longer save you. Cheryl is also good in the Pidgeot Lax build, so something to bear in mind there. And Cry of Destruction was another great way to get rid of special energy cards, so seems like Snorlax is probably going to remain a deck and is going to be around. Bear in mind, every deck will have a Prime Catcher in their list now as well, but at least you're happy to see Rope going. That was previously sometimes a bit of a headache card that was just a good card that found its way into decks that happened to collateral Snorlax and give them outs to switch, but Prime Catcher is pretty much taking that mantle anyway. I think the deck's going to be fine, just a little bit less dangerous going into the next set, which I personally think is a healthy thing for the game, because now there's more counterplay that, any deck can go with, because they're not afraid of Avery Horn as a combo package.
Onto Roaring Moon, another kind of turbo archetype, and this is going to be an interesting one because obviously we've already talked about two potential great attacking options to go alongside Sada's Vitality, so there may be just naturally competitors for Roaring Moon in kind of a Sada box deck. We'll have to wait and see how that works out. In terms of actual cards that's using VIP Pass is probably the biggest one. Realistically, Squawkabilly and Greninja are kind of the backbone of the early turns of Roaring Moon to try and get you off racing as quickly as possible, so could be more difficult to find those because obviously you can't buddy popping for them. You're going to have to rely on Ultra Balls and Nest Balls, which, again, we're actually going into a rotation for once with quite a lot of Ball Search, which is nice because sometimes you go into rotations where there's like one or two mediocre Ball Search cards and it feels really awkward. So it's really weird that we're losing the best search in the game and still going into a format with a plethora of search options. So we're not really sort of gasping for them. It's just that these kinds of decks are going to have to adapt to the ones that they would usually use. Again, Cross Switcher and Escape Rope, great switching options, especially for being aggressive with the early Roaring Moon plays when you're able to weave together multiple additional energy attachments to try and gouging or even Calamity Storm in the early turns. And then Moltres V as well, another attacking option here and there, as well as getting an extra energy on board to help weave things together. Happy to see Path rotate. I think Path is, again, kind of awkward for early turns, especially if an opponent's able to lock it in going first, because it kind of really relies on you having your own stadium outs to try and get going, with Squawkabilly and Greninja being locked out of the game. So pretty happy to see that. And similarly to Miraidon, very happy to see Kyogre going from those Lost Zone engines, because that was naturally their way of trying to take multiple prizes in a turn. Typically against those Lost Zone engines, you would have to go through 6 Pokemon, and when you're a multi-prize Pokemon, that can sometimes get a little bit awkward if they're able to uptrade, especially if they're able to weave in a Kyogre turn as well, because it means they need to find maybe 1 KO before you're actually in danger of losing their game. So never going to be sad to see that go. It's going to be interesting to see how Roaring Moon plays out. Like I say, there's a couple of very interesting ancient Pokemon that maybe Sada will be preferable to play with instead of Roaring Moon, but still Frenzied Gouging is an insanely strong attack, so I still think we're going to see some amount of Moon in the format. It's just going to be interesting to see whether it turns into a box, whether there's multiple decks going around, or whether Roaring Moon is still able to be the most popular Sada archetype going. There's still a couple of question marks we have about things like Raging Bolt and Gouging Fire, whereas Roaring Moon, a basic Pokemon that takes an automatic KO against some of these 300 HP Pokemon, is going to be really, really useful still. So all of a sudden, when you have a lot of similar 2-prize racing decks, typically the best one just wins. So there might be a bit of a competition between this and Miraidon and maybe some of these new Pokemon. So not quite sure what's going to come out on top, but I still have hope for Roaring Moon, to be honest. I still think there's a lot going for it.
Onto Entei Iron Valiant. It's another one of these turbo engines that Jack was just talking about, so VIP is a bit of a loss here, where you lose that easy answer to get your attacker in the mix or get multiple Valiant in the mix as well as a Squawkabilly, and then you can continue to churn through the deck. So there are, at least for Valiant builds, the option to play Techno Radar, which can get a couple Valiants out. So you can at least get those into the mix early to get some Tachyon bit dancing going. But losing Escape Rope is 4 of your pivot options. You do at least get to play Prime Catcher, so that's 1 bought back in the list. So maybe you can make up for it with maybe just a couple extra Jet Energy coming into the 60. So I still think you could still have decent tempo at your disposal. It's just going to be a little bit clunkier in those opening stages, which is somewhat of a shame. The The good news is, again, some of your worst matchups are disappearing. Mew was a huge problem because your damage output wasn't great. Path was a big issue in Mew. It was a big issue in Miraidon and Tina. Urshifu obviously had the Inteleon VMAX part of the deck, which was just high hit points and bursting through your multi-prizes quite easily. And Kyogre with the Aqua Storm gave even Lost Box players just a lot of time to make that catch-up hero play. So seeing all of these awkward matchups fall by the wayside, giving you, more Lost Box engines to deal with, more evolving decks to deal with, and possibly have devolve plays into, gives you a clearer field of vision for the Entei Valiant deck. And of course, it still has that Radiant Charizard, which can help you in those 2v2 prize racing matchups, knowing that you have this great late game beat stick to throw at the opponent to force them into those awkward positions. So I think the deck loses a bit of power level, a bit of that scary donk potential, which I think is good for the game, but also isn't going to be falling off quite as easily as it can do in the current format. It feels better positioned to me.
Onto Chien-Pao, a deck that's kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit as of late, but I actually think this is going to be one of the decks that is pretty happy with this rotation. Loses some key parts of the deck. VIP pass is one of the biggest, but Poffin able to search out your low HP basics is really good. It means that you can then sort of prioritize things like Chien-Pao with your other search cards. So still being able to get Frigibax is hugely important because, just getting your basics into play to be able to start super colding from turn 2 is really important. Cross Switcher and Escape Rope, again, as I've always mentioned, great switching options, but in particular in this deck, being able to really push Radiant Greninja. Cross Switcher plus Canceling Cologne plus Greninja was kind of the backbone of Chien-Pao for a little while, and one of the biggest things to, try and push people out of the game. So that's going to be a little bit more difficult, but I still think there is definitely options for being able to do that. We still have Grime Catcher, which is going to be really important because Irida is able to search that, which is fantastic. You also have Iron Hands, which at the moment can, pretty easily go back into the deck, and I think is really important for the deck to be able to still have these huge power turns. So there's still some very powerful things Chien-Pao can do, and even though it's losing a couple of key cards, it's sort of mitigated by the fact that your engine is completely Irida based anyway. So early turns, you're finding Poffins pretty easily. The middle and late game turns, you can find the Grime Catcher quite nicely, as well as being able to weave together sort of Iron Hands combos. And losing Path to Peak, again, is obviously brilliant because it means that you're thinning the deck out for more energy, trying to then burn them to draw more cards with Greninja and try and weave these combos together. So yeah, it's an archetype that isn't seeing too much play right now, but I actually think it's one of the archetypes that is served a little bit better from this rotation because all of these losses are definitely manageable and is sort of a situation where you're not having to go out of your way to manage them as well. There's some decks that will try and accommodate things like VIP path rotating and stuff like that, whereas at the moment you're already playing cards naturally in the deck that help you try and fit in things like Poffin and Grime Catcher anyway. So it's like the deck is pretty much just going forward without really losing anything major. So I feel like it's going to be a bit of a resurgence for Chien-Pao. It could actually be a really good time. And again, another really, really interesting archetype to go into the format with already established lists, because lists are going to look incredibly similar given that we're going to be pretty much 1-for-1 trading certain cards in and out. So it could be another really, really good one to try out in the early stage of testing for the post-rotation meta as well.
And then finally, we did just want to touch on a couple of these decks that are more on the fringes, on the outside looking in, but they are also going to be most likely declining because they're all losing some key pieces. We have Claw for Electrode, which is already a bit of a gimmicky deck, but without the Spicy Season Curry, Hisuian Electrode can no longer uptrade into Charizard, so rather than having a couple of decent type coverage at your disposal, you're just a fighting one prize Pokemon, and that's a lot less impressive, so I wouldn't expect that deck to see much more play. Palkia as its own archetype without Chien-Pao and Baxcalibur, all these other things, also seems a lot less impressive without that Melanie. That was the backbone supporter to keep you accelerating throughout the entire game. Post Star Portal, you lose that Ice Rider Calyrex, which was one of those crucial attackers, as was Suicune V as a basic attacking option, and the Cross Switchers, was a crucial item card alongside the Irida package. A Prime Catcher could go in, and Palkia notably obviously stays with Greninja, so that combination's still there. I actually think Palkia plus Greninja could once again find its way back into Chien-Pao. It could also be part of Goldengo as well, which seems like a decent deck actually when there's no more part of the peaking format. So I think Palkia's going to be fine. I think Greninja will be fine. They'll still be mainstays, but I think as its own deck, like that thick Palkia line with a ton of Melanie, that's obviously no longer possible. Arceus as well. It's losing most of its pals. Most of the things it used to accelerate to are all falling by the wayside. We're losing most of the VMAXs in those last few sets, so there's a lot less options to Trinity Nova, which is a huge issue, and you have less, solid type coverages, and crucially, you're losing Path. That's been the thing holding Arceus together, that little sellotape keeping Arceus alive for the last few sets, where you had Judge Path and you just said, well, maybe I brick the opponent and I've got Starbirth to get me this vicious combo, and sometimes it works out. You lost Path, which makes me think Arceus now is just like this low damage output deck that's kind of consistent but doesn't have much else going for it. So I really don't see much hope for Arceus outside of, again, like an engine Pokemon if you just want to have a V-Star power. Beyond that, I feel like it's going to be less and less relevant. And Lugia losing a ton of its own buddies. The single strike package is a big issue to be losing. There is still the possibility to play like a Snorlax Weirdir. Those are still in the format. We still have Therapeutic and a handful of other colorless energy, but it is getting more and more awkward, especially because we are losing some of the critical supporter cards. Professor Burnett has been so vital. It's been going up in counts in the latest Lugia decks, and even now it's not seeing a huge amount of play. So when it's a lower consistency deck than the other archetypes out there, when it's going to get bullied by some of these really high tempo decks like Miraidon, Roaring Moon that can come out the gate swinging so quickly, I feel like it's just going to be, again, in this awkward position where the Tempest Dive isn't doing enough to get through these other EX Pokemon at this stage, and Snorlax isn't necessarily doing enough damage either, so it's just found itself with not enough damage outputs in the format anymore with its lack of attacking options. So all of these seem to be in decline. They've had their chance. They've been popular for a while, at least the V-Stars on the page. Clothtrode's kind of that meme deck, but did just want to touch on it because not many people would naturally think that Spicy Season Curry is rotating because it's an Astral Radiance card, but it does have that E-block on it. So yeah, these are some other decks that are kind of on the fringes right now that I did just want to touch on, basically rotating in their own right outside of being bit part players from now on.
So that is it for the individual archetypes. It's going to be a pretty interesting one. Like we've already mentioned, there's less of a focus on multiple archetypes going. There's just two really big ones in Mew and Rapid Strike. But there's a lot of these key pieces that basically every deck used. So not like one we've seen in a little while, I think. Knowing that we have some side grades already, I think means that it's going to maybe be a little bit less impactful than we first thought. But yeah, even the reveal of things like Poffin and Prime Catcher really kind of tone things down.
So that's everything. Let us know your thoughts down below. What cards are you happy to see going from this rotation? What cards are you going to be upset to put back in the binder? I've already started to make a ton of decks in the new F block and on format, starting to look at what's coming out from Temporal Forces. So I'm also going to put a link in the description with my Cube Koga decks, but also there's going to be a ton of videos coming out once we get the full expansion of Temporal Forces, which shouldn't actually be too far away now. We're starting to get those last few trickles of cards in the next few days and weeks, so that should be coming pretty soon, which means we can sort of turn our focus and split it up between post-rotation and the upcoming Paldean Fates meta, which, spoilers, isn't going to be too different from our current standard format based on what we're seeing so far. So I think this is going to be impactful, especially because Path of the Peak, this just feels over and over again, feels like the dynamic shift in that decks are going to be less explosive in the early game with Path going, but we also have less control of the late game because most decks can now sit with Greninja or Mew EX. A lot of these other engine Pokemon are going to be less hindered than they have been in the past, so it feels like they're just a few pieces away from closing the game in their own right. Making sure that Pidgeot EX can no longer be disrupted is also a huge thing, so if someone needs like literally one piece to win the game, thinking of things like Boss, for example, they can just tutor it out. So it might be a big dynamic shift as to what engine Pokemon come out on top. So going to be a really interesting one to follow. Let us know your thoughts down below, and we'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.